There is something that happens in the private conversations the avoidant has during no contact that almost nobody on the outside ever gets to hear. Not because they are hiding something dramatic, because the way the avoidant talks about you to the people closest to them reveals, in ways their direct communication with you never quite did, what is actually happening in their interior. The private conversation is different from the public one, different from the composed and self-sufficient presentation the avoidant tends to maintain, different from the silence of no contact itself. In the private conversation, with the specific person or people they trust most, something slightly more honest tends to emerge. Not completely honest, not the full and unguarded account of what they actually feel, but closer to it than anything else currently available. And what emerges is worth understanding, not because it changes what you should do, but because the accurate account of what is being said is more useful than the stories that tend to fill the silence. The first thing the avoidant tends to say to their friends during no contact is something that sounds like explanation, a narrative about why the distance is reasonable, about why the situation arrived where it arrived, about what made the relationship complicated, and why the current silence makes sense given everything that happened. This narrative is not entirely dishonest. It contains real elements, real observations about genuine difficulties in the dynamic, real reasoning about why things unfolded as they did, but it is selective in a specific and consistent way. The narrative the avoidant offers their friends during no contact tends to emphasize the moments where the relationship felt like pressure, where the closeness felt like too much, where their need for space felt legitimate and their withdrawal felt reasonable. It underemphasizes, or omits entirely, the cost of the withdrawal to you, the specific ways the inconsistency landed, what the dynamic was like from your side. This is not cynical revisionism. It is the architecture doing what it always does, constructing the account of events that justifies the distance, that makes the self-sufficiency feel like clarity rather than defense, that converts the withdrawal into wisdom rather than pattern. The friends hear this version, and most of them, because they are the avoidance friends and their loyalty is to the avoidance version of events, accept it, reflect it back, confirm the narrative that the distance was reasonable and the silence makes sense. But there is something else that tends to happen in these conversations, something that the narrative is partly designed to manage but cannot entirely contain. The avoidant mentions you more than the narrative requires. A story about why the silence makes sense does not require multiple references to specific things you said or did, does not require the recounting of particular moments that had nothing to do with why the distance felt necessary, does not require the kind of specific and detailed recall that belongs to someone who is actively, even if reluctantly, thinking about you. And yet the avoidant mentions the specific things, the particular quality of something you did, the specific way you said something, the precise detail of a moment that surfaces in the telling even when it is not strictly relevant to the point being made. The friends notice this. Sometimes they say something, often they simply observe it. The avoidant talking about someone they are supposedly moving away from, with the specific and detailed recall of someone who has not moved away at all. Because they have not. The no contact is real, the silence is real, the distance is real, and the interior is somewhere else entirely, still in the connection, still holding the specific and irreplaceable quality of what existed with you, still returning to the details that the narrative was supposed to have made unnecessary. The second thing the avoidant says to their friends during no contact is harder to characterize because it tends to emerge sideways rather than directly. It is the comparison. Something happens in the avoidant's life, and in the telling of it to their friend there is a moment, brief and sometimes quickly moved past, where the current experience is held against the experience of being with you, not always explicitly, sometimes as a slight hesitation before continuing, sometimes as a brief and quickly suppressed acknowledgement that this specific thing would have been different if you were in it. The friend catches it, may or may not say something. The avoidant may or may not acknowledge what just surfaced, but it surfaced, because it is present, continuously, as the specific and persistent comparison that genuine attachment produces when the thing it was attached to is no longer there. The current experiences keep brushing against the standard of what existed with you, and the brushing produces the brief and revealing surfacing in the private conversations with people who know the avoidant well enough to notice. This is not the avoidant performing for their friends. It is the interior bleeding slightly into the private conversation despite the management, despite the narrative, despite everything the architecture is doing to maintain the presentation of someone who is fine, and whose distance is reasonable, and whose silence is a choice they are comfortable with. The details, the comparisons, the specific and unnecessary recall of what existed with you. These are the avoidance interior, speaking in the only way currently available to it. Not to you, to the people they trust, in the private conversations, in the moments when the management is slightly less total than it is in the silence. What I want to say about all of this is simple and direct. The avoidance private conversations are revealing, are genuinely informative about what is happening in the interior during the no contact, are evidence of the specific and persistent presence of you in the mind and the memory of someone who is maintaining a silence that their interior is not maintaining. And this information, however accurate, does not change what your own life requires. The details they mention to their friends, the comparisons that surface unbidden, the narrative that requires more reference to you than the narrative's own purpose justifies, all of it is real. All of it is happening on the other side of the silence, and your life is happening on your side of it, with or without their private acknowledgement of what they are still holding. Your life does not require their private holding to be worth living fully. It requires your presence in it, which is the only thing worth directing your attention toward. Not what they are saying to their friends, what you are doing with your own actual days. That is the more important story. It always was. The friends hear the narrative, and something worth understanding about what they actually observe, sitting across from the avoidant during no contact, is that the narrative and the person delivering it are not entirely aligned. The avoidant presents the distance as reasonable, as the natural outcome of circumstances that made the silence the sensible response. The friends nod, agree where agreement is easy, offer the reflections the avoidant is looking for. And then the avoidant says your name again, for the third time in a conversation that was supposed to be about something else. The friends notice. This is the honest thing about what happens in these private conversations during no contact. The people who know the avoidant well are not fooled by the narrative in the way the narrative is designed to be believed. They see the gap between the composure and the specific recall, between the reasonable distance and the unreasonable frequency of the reference, between the person who is fine and the person who keeps returning to the same subject despite the conversation having moved on. They may not say anything. The avoidance friends have usually learned, through the specific experience of being close to someone who manages their interior carefully, that direct observation tends to produce deflection, that naming what they are seeing produces the composed and slightly distant response that closes the topic rather than opening it. So they observe without naming. And what they observe is someone who is not as fine as the narrative requires. There is a specific kind of thing the avoidant says to their closest friend during no contact that does not get said to anyone else. Not because it is a confession exactly, because the closest friend occupies a specific position in the avoidant's life. The position of the person who is trusted enough to receive something slightly closer to the unmanaged version. With this person, in the specific privacy of genuine closeness, something occasionally surfaces that the narrative was not able to contain. Not, I miss them, necessarily. Not the direct and vulnerable admission that the no contact is harder than it looks, but something adjacent to that. A question asked in a particular way. A silence that follows the mention of your name that is longer than the silence that follows other names. A moment where the composure slips slightly, and what is underneath it is briefly, quietly visible. The closest friend sees it, recognizes it for what it is, and the avoidant, having let it surface for a moment, typically does what the architecture does when something gets closer to the surface than is comfortable, moves the conversation somewhere else. But the moment happened, the surfacing was real, and the closest friend carries the knowledge of it forward as the honest version of what the no contact actually contains on the avoidance side. What the avoidant does not say to their friends during no contact is worth naming too, because the absence is as revealing as the presence. They do not say they are glad the silence happened, not with the specific and genuine quality that would belong to someone who actually is. The narrative may suggest it, the composure may present it, but the gladness that belongs to genuine resolution, to the clean and completed processing of a connection that has been adequately released, That gladness is not present in the private conversations, because it is not present in the interior. The no contact has not produced the resolution the architecture was hoping it would produce, has not reduced you to the manageable significance of something that mattered and is now past, has not done what distance usually does in the avoidance experience, which is to deactivate the attachment to the point where the distance becomes genuinely comfortable. The distance is not genuinely comfortable. The friends know this even when the avoidant does not say it directly, because the specific and revealing details keep surfacing, the comparisons keep appearing, the name keeps returning to conversations that did not require it. The no contact is doing what no contact does in the exterior, creating silence, creating space, creating the practical reality of two people who are not in contact. It is not doing what the architecture needed it to do, which is make you smaller in the interior. You are not smaller. Here is what is worth taking from all of this. The private conversations are happening, the details are surfacing, the narrative is being maintained in the way the architecture requires it to be maintained and is failing to fully contain what it was built to contain. This is real. It is happening on the other side of the silence, and it does not require anything from you, not your attention, not your continued availability in case the private conversations eventually produce something visible, not the organization of your present tense around the question of what the avoidant is or is not saying to their friends about you. What the avoidant's friends are observing in those private moments is their concern, their information to hold and to do with what they can. Your information is different. Your information is the honest account of your own experience, of what the dynamic cost, of what the silence has returned to you, of what your own interior is reporting about what you need and where you are and what your life is asking you to move toward. That is the conversation worth having, not with the avoidance friends, with yourself, in the specific and private and genuinely yours interior that has been insufficiently attended to for long enough. What is it saying? That is the question worth sitting with, not what they are saying about you, what you are saying to yourself, about your own life, about what comes next. That conversation is the one that matters. The no contact extends. Days become weeks. The avoidance conversations with their friends continue. The narrative continues, and something shifts in those conversations over time that is worth describing honestly. The justifications become less frequent. In the early weeks of no contact, the narrative is active, requires maintenance, requires the repeated explaining of why the silence makes sense, and why the distance is reasonable, and why the situation arrived where it arrived. The friends hear the explanation often enough that the repetition itself becomes information. You do not repeatedly explain something you are settled about. You explain something you are still convincing yourself of. But as the weeks extend, the explaining quiets. Not because the avoidant has arrived at genuine peace with the silence, because the explaining has exhausted itself, has run through its available material, has produced the confirmation it was looking for, and found that the confirmation does not fully deliver what it promised. The friends stop hearing the narrative and start hearing something quieter, something that sits in the spaces between the conversation rather than in its content. The specific quality of someone who is carrying something they are no longer actively processing, but have not yet set down. One of the things the avoidant says to their friends during extended no contact that tends to surface in the quieter phase is something that sounds like reflection rather than explanation. They talk about what they learned, not always about you specifically, about themselves, about patterns they are beginning to recognize, about the specific ways they engage with people who get close, about the distance and what it costs, and whether the cost is something they are still comfortable paying. This reflection is real. It is the reckoning I have described in other conversations, finding its way into the private conversations, being spoken aloud for perhaps the first time, being given the specific and tentative form of words, rather than remaining entirely internal. The friends listen. Sometimes they say the thing the avoidant needs to hear. Sometimes they simply witness. But the reflection is happening. The private processing is moving, however slowly and however non-linearly, in the direction of honest self-examination. Whether that self-examination produces anything visible, anything that crosses the silence toward you, is genuinely uncertain. The reflection is real, and the action it might produce is not guaranteed. What I want to say about the entirety of what is happening in the avoidance private conversations during no contact is this. It is more than nothing, more than the silence suggests. More interior movement, more genuine reckoning, more specific and persistent presence of you in the mind and the memory and the private conversations than the exterior silence communicates. And it is not enough to build your present tense around, not because it is not real, because your present tense belongs to you, to the actual, ordinary, genuinely yours texture of your own days, to the conversations you are having with your own interior about what you need and what you have learned and what you want the next chapter to look like. Those conversations are more important than anything being said about you on the other side of the silence. Not more interesting necessarily. The avoidance private reckoning has a genuine psychological richness that is worth understanding, but more important, because they are yours, because they are happening in the only life you actually have, because the quality of attention you bring to them is the quality of attention your own becoming deserves. Whatever the avoidant is saying to their friends, whatever is surfacing in the private conversations, whatever the reckoning is producing in their interior, is theirs. Your interior is yours, and it is the more important territory. Right now, today, in the actual present tense of your actual life. That is where your attention belongs, not across the silence. Here, the no contact continues. The private conversations continue. The reckoning on their side continues in whatever form it takes, and your life continues too. Not as a parallel story running alongside theirs, as the primary story, the one that is actually yours, the one that does not require resolution on their side to move forward. What the avoidant says to their friends about you during no contact is real information about what is happening in their interior, the details that surface, the comparisons that appear unbidden, the narrative that requires more reference to you than its own logic justifies. All of it is real, and the most honest thing available to say about all of it is simple. They have not let go, and your life is not waiting for them to decide whether to. It is happening now, in the actual, present, completely yours texture of an ordinary day that belongs entirely to you. That is enough. It was always enough. Your life is not on hold. Whatever is being said on the other side of the silence, whatever the avoidant carries privately, whatever their friends observe in the unguarded moments, none of it changes what your own days are asking of you, which is simply to be present in them, fully, without one eye on the silence. That is the whole instruction. The present tense of your life does not pause for anyone's reckoning. What is being said across the silence, what is being felt, what is being slowly, privately processed on the other side, is real. And it is not your primary concern. Your primary concern is the actual day in front of you. The ordinary and unglamorous and completely yours texture of being present in your own existence. The specific and irreplaceable quality of a life that is happening now, rather than in the conditional tense of someone else's eventual arrival. That life is worth showing up for, fully, today. That is the whole thing.